The Supreme Court just dropped a decision that has sent shockwaves through Westminster, and Priti Patel is absolutely unleashing on Keir Starmer in a way that nobody saw coming. This isn't about political disagreements or policy debates. This is about the highest court in the land ruling against the government on a matter so fundamental, so serious, that it exposes everything wrong with how Starmer has been operating since taking power. And Priti Patel, never one to hold back when she sees weakness or wrongdoing, has come out swinging with a statement so scathing, so thoroughly documented and so impossible to refute that it's left Starmer's team scrambling for any response that doesn't make things worse. The Supreme Court ruling itself is devastating enough, a clear judgment that the government acted unlawfully, that they overstepped their authority and that they showed contempt for the very legal framework they're supposed to uphold. But what makes this moment truly explosive is how Patel has connected this ruling to a broader pattern of behaviour from Starmer's government, a pattern of ignoring rules when they're inconvenient, of pushing boundaries until the courts have to step in, of governing as if accountability doesn't apply to them. She's not just criticising one decision or one policy failure. She's using this Supreme Court judgment as evidence of a government that fundamentally doesn't respect the rule of law, that views legal constraints as obstacles to be worked around rather than as essential protections for citizens' rights. And she's doing it with the kind of prosecutorial precision that comes from someone who knows exactly how government is supposed to work and can clearly articulate when it's going catastrophically wrong. The timing couldn't be worse for Starmer, coming right on the heels of his humiliations by Tom Hardy, the Commons Speaker, Elon Musk and Nigel Farage. Each of those incidents exposed different aspects of his unfitness for leadership, his thin skin, his dishonesty, his inability to handle pressure. But this Supreme Court ruling and Patel's response to it strike at something even more fundamental: whether Starmer's government can be trusted to operate within the law and respect the constitutional limits on executive power. When the highest court in your country rules that you've acted unlawfully, that's not a political disagreement, that's a finding of fact about your government breaking the rules. And when someone like Priti Patel, who understands power and how it should be exercised, calls you out for it with chapter and verse documentation, you're in serious trouble. The Supreme Court case had been working its way through the legal system for months, but most political observers hadn't paid much attention to it because it seemed like a technical matter that would be resolved through compromise or procedural adjustments. The case involved government decisions about immigration, policy implementation, specifically about how ministerial powers were being used to make changes without proper parliamentary scrutiny or oversight. Civil liberties groups had challenged the government's approach, arguing that ministers were essentially legislating through executive action rather than going through Parliament as constitutional principle requires. Starmer's government had defended their actions as necessary for efficient administration and had argued that they had legal authority to make the changes they'd implemented. They'd been confident, perhaps overconfident, that the courts would defer to executive judgment on policy matters and would accept the government's interpretation of ministerial powers. That confidence was shattered when the Supreme Court issued its ruling. The judgment was unambiguous and damning. The court found that the government had indeed overstepped its authority, that the changes implemented required parliamentary approval, and that the approach taken showed insufficient regard for proper constitutional process. The justices didn't just rule against the government on technical grounds, they specifically criticised the mindset that had led to these decisions, noting that respect for parliamentary sovereignty and constitutional limits on executive power are fundamental to British democracy and cannot be set aside simply because following proper procedures is slower or more difficult than acting unilaterally. The ruling was released in the morning, and by afternoon, Priti Patel had issued a statement that went far beyond the usual opposition response to unfavourable court decisions for the government. She didn't just say the ruling was correct or criticise the specific policy at issue. She used the Supreme Court's findings as a launching point for a comprehensive attack on Starmer's entire approach to governance. Patel started by noting that she'd served in government herself, that she understood the pressures and challenges of making difficult decisions while trying to deliver on policy commitments. But she said that those pressures never justify ignoring constitutional constraints or treating legal limits on power as suggestions rather than as binding rules. She pointed out that the Supreme Court had essentially accused Starmer's government of the same kind of behaviour that opposition politicians had been highlighting for months, a pattern of acting as if the normal rules and procedures don't apply to them, of pushing boundaries until someone with authority stops them, of prioritising what's convenient over what's legal and proper. The court ruling, she argued, vindicated everything critics had been saying about this government's contempt for accountability and proper process. This wasn't partisan criticism anymore. This was the highest legal authority in the country confirming that the concerns were legitimate and that the government's conduct was unlawful. Patel then connected this ruling to other incidents that had exposed Starmer's character and approach to leadership. She brought up his confrontation with Tom Hardy, where he'd responded to legitimate questions with threats and intimidation rather than with honest engagement. She referenced the PMQ's disaster, where he'd broken parliamentary rules and had to be reprimanded by the Speaker. She cited the issues raised by Elon Musk about government waste and cronyism, and the devastating speech by Nigel Farage that had documented systematic dishonesty about spending and priorities. Each of these incidents, Patel argued, showed the same underlying problem: a prime minister who doesn't believe rules apply to him, who reacts with hostility when held accountable, and who governs based on what he can get away with rather than on what's right or legal. The Supreme Court ruling was just the latest and most serious example of this pattern, because it involved the government actually breaking the law, not just behaving badly or being dishonest in political contexts. When your government is found by the Supreme Court to have acted unlawfully, Patel said, that's not a minor technical violation. That's a fundamental failure of governance that should result in resignations and serious consequences. She demanded that Starmer personally apologise to Parliament and to the public for his government's unlawful conduct. She called for the resignation of whichever minister had been responsible for the decisions that the court had struck down. And she insisted on a full parliamentary inquiry into how the government had allowed this situation to develop and what safeguards would be put in place to prevent future unlawful action. Most devastatingly, she questioned whether Starmer, as a former director of public prosecutions who had spent years lecturing others about respect for the rule of law, had any credibility left after his government had been found to have violated that very principle. The hypocrisy, she suggested, was staggering and disqualifying. How could anyone trust a prime minister who talked constantly about integrity and legal standards while his own government ignored those standards when they became inconvenient? The statement was circulated to every major media outlet and posted across social media, where it immediately began generating massive attention and discussion. Starmer's team was caught completely off guard by both the severity of the court ruling and the ferocity of Patel's response. They'd expected to lose the case. Legal advisors had warned that their position was weak, but they hadn't anticipated such strong language from the Supreme Court or such effective exploitation of the ruling by their political opponents. The initial government response was defensive and tone-deaf, attempting to minimise the significance of the ruling by saying it was about narrow technical matters of procedure rather than about the substance of policy. This framing fell apart immediately because the Supreme Court's judgment had been explicitly about the government exceeding its legal authority, which is about as substantive an issue as exists in constitutional law. Trying to characterise a ruling that your government acted unlawfully as a technical procedural matter only made them look more arrogant and dismissive of legal constraints. Media coverage of the ruling and Patel's response was extensive and largely sympathetic to her criticisms. Constitutional experts were interviewed and almost uniformly agreed that the Supreme Court's concerns were serious and that the government's approach had been troubling.